Sometimes anger is a very necessary response to a situation. If someone is being oppressed right in front of you, anger is what motivates you to speak up. It's the catalyst for justice.
Welcome to another episode of the Mark Groves podcast. I have returning guest, Manoj Dias. Welcome, my friend.
Hello, old friend. Good to see you.
It's so good to have you. For the people listening, Manoj is a meditation teacher. He's an author. He's also the co-founder of the app called Open, which I'm sure we'll get to talking a little bit more about that. I had the absolute honor of surprisingly landing in the beautiful design of your app when Kylie had downloaded, and she's like, you got to come check out this app. The design's amazing. And I look at it and I'm like, oh, this is Manoj's app. And that's Ali Ma's teaching on there. This is amazing. So the app looks beautiful, and I look forward to chatting about, how you guys created it and all that too.
Thank you. Yeah, likewise.
I think it's a real testament to creation when you can make a digital experience feel like an actual, like when I opened it, I felt like I was in some sort of Buddhist temple or something, but it was on my iPhone.
Yeah, it must have been a pretty cool Buddhist temple.
Yeah, it was very designed forward.
Yeah, I mean, all the ones that I've been to in my life, smelly, dingy, have great energy, but there's mice floating around and all of that.
So yeah, it was an upgrade from that. So I wanted to explore with you today because you talk a lot about breathwork, meditation, these types of tools. And I think one of the greatest challenges that we experience in romantic relationships, but life and relationships in general, is being able to not just navigate our feelings, but also not react from them. Like, I feel so much of our world is created through our reactivity and not, embracing our emotion in whatever way that even is possible.
So much of my work has been around understanding the internal experience that, we're having in this day-to-day thing called life. But it's also about reconciling that with the external experience. And we obviously don't live in silos. We don't live in a vacuum. We are constantly interacting with people. We are constantly feeling things because of those people. And it becomes a way of how do we move through this world, really understanding how that relationship exists for us. We know from basic mindfulness principles that the term that Jon Kabat-Zinn uses often is, understanding our internal, external experience in a non-judgmental way, a non-judgmental attitude. But I find that really difficult. Like, of course you're going to be judging what you feel. Of course you're going to be processing and analyzing and reconciling that with past experiences, what you're absorbing on social media, what your therapist says, what you hear on a podcast and all those sorts of things. So for me, how we move through this world reconciling our feelings is through wisdom. And wisdom is really what we cultivate through meditation practice, breathwork practice, mindfulness practice. And essentially, wisdom is understanding our own minds. It's understanding that, whoa, I've just been triggered by something. There is a feeling. That feeling could be heat in the chest. It could be like a clenching, could be a constriction. And now I'm feeling anger because of it, and that's the first stage. The second stage is not to actually suppress that, because I think we are taught culturally that certain feelings are good, certain feelings are bad. And one of my pet peeves in the wellness world is that the only feeling that you're really allowed to cultivate is happiness and joy. But the reality is that's just not our lived experience. I mean, it's not my lived experience.
No.
Sure. I navigate anger, sadness, grief, rage, and over the years, me reconciling that with the knowledge of how feelings and emotions work and how my body processes these things has really helped me to navigate those things. But that's really the interplay and the intersection that I work with is how do we first allow ourselves to feel what we feel, and then cultivating this quality of our mind, of our awareness, how can we have the wisdom to be able to use that and harness that and not avoid it or run away from it or suppress it.
Well, this tool to be able to move from Because when you said judgment, like judgment of emotions, to live in a world where we don't judge our emotions, I mean, I agree with you. That feels like sometimes an impossible task, especially if we haven't trained the mind to be observant of the feeling and then to. So, how do we even create space between? If I'm someone who, when I get upset or I do something, let's say, quote unquote, wrong, or I get defensive, let's say, in my romantic relationship, and then my thoughts are like, you always do this. This is classic. You're not, underlying not enoughness. How do I even begin the journey of going from like, I don't even know how I can see my way through being able to navigate conflict with some form of regulation, to this place of non-judgment or the attempt to maintain a space of non-judgment?
I mean, the beauty of mindfulness and meditation is that, and our brains actually, is that they're malleable. Because of neuroplasticity, we know that our brains can reshape and reform due to repeated experiences. And so Viktor Frankl said it the best, and I use this example a lot. Between stimulus and response, there is a space, and within that space is our power to choose. And within our choice lies our growth and our freedom. And I'm sure I butchered that at some point, but when he talks about the space, he's really talking about mindfulness. There's a stimulus and then there's the response. And so that space we can cultivate. We can learn to operate more within that space over time. And hey, look, I'll be the first to admit, even after 14 years, 15 years of practice, I still forget to operate in that space. I'll be reactive with my partner. I'll be reactive with people at work. But it's a lot less than I was perhaps 15 years ago. And I'm a lot more aware of, oh shit, I overreacted at that point. But the stimulus is first being really present to what's in our body at that moment, like what actually is affected in that moment. And anger is something that I've had to navigate, throughout my life as a byproduct of my childhood. And for me, anger is very quick to arise in my interpersonal relationships. And I know exactly where it arises. It arises in the chest for me, and I feel like this knotting in my stomach. And so these days, as soon as something triggers me, I'm placing my attention on the body. I'm like, oh, where do I feel this? And then I feel the knot. And as soon as I go to the body and not the reaction from the mind, I'm creating that space. I'm like, oh, okay, I'm here. I can give myself permission to feel the anger. And I think anger, as an example, is something so beautiful, so powerful, if we can learn to harness the emotion, if we can learn to harness the power of that feeling. Because for me, it focuses me. It gets me super clear. It gets me super energized. Historically, I've reacted from that. I've let my emotions get out of the way. My mind hasn't been present to it. But these days, I can use it. It can fuel me, and I can navigate a discussion a lot easier. But that space is really mindfulness, and one is meditation that helps us with that. But, if you're not a meditator, and that's fine, being mindful really supports that. It's simply watching. How am I reacting in this moment? Am I reacting in a way that is causing harm to myself and to others? And does that feel good? And if the answer is no, then you have a choice. And that choice, again, is mindfulness, the ability to choose how we respond moment to moment. And so over time, what we learn is in almost any given moment, there's a choice. One choice leads us towards more suffering, whether that's another argument with our partner, whether that's sleeping on the couch, whether that's just being grumpy, whatever it is. And another choice leads us towards happiness and ease and a sense of inner peace. And so then hopefully we have the wisdom to be able to choose happiness as opposed to suffering.
What do you think prevents us from leaving the familiar loop? Like when you're in that space and normally you might choose to go left or react, that you actually take this wiser direction. Why do you think we tend to stay in the old thing, even though we know that what will produce the life, the results we want is actually on this other side?
Familiarity, right? It's familiar, like it's modeled to us from a young age, or it's just our habitual response to things. It's habituated within us. It feels normal. It feels natural. And again, shout out to my dad. I love you if you're hearing this, but he grew up with a lot of anger, and his spectrum of emotions and feelings were anger, rage, or complete joy and happiness. There was no middle ground. for him, right? So for me, I growing up, I was also very much like that. If something triggered me, I wouldn't say, "Hey, I don't like that," or "That doesn't feel good," or "That doesn't sit right with me." I would suppress because I didn't want to be like my father, and then I
Yeah.
would explode, right? And that's a very familiar pattern for me. Over time, what I've had to really learn and sit with is first to be present to what's experienced, and then to change that loop, to change that pattern. And to change that pattern, it's actually giving voice to what I'm feeling. And then realizing that whenever I raise my voice, and if I tell my partner, you shouldn't do that, like that never actually works. Like, it actually
I can,
never
I
works,
can validate this. It doesn't actually.
right? Yet we keep doing it. And so after a little while, I'm like, hey, this is actually just not effective. If I want to get my own way, it's not an effective way of handling things. And it becomes a choice that becomes clear over time, is that each moment gives you, freedom or suffering. And I want to be free. I don't care about being right all the time. I want to be free.
I love that. And could you speak more to, because you spoke about anger and you spoke about anger being on some level beautiful, like a beautiful experience, a powerful experience. Can you speak more to why anger is important? And I think a lot of the times people are afraid of meditation or that silent experience because of what they might find. And
Mm.
in all your teaching, I'm curious. Let's start with the beauty of anger, and then I can circle back to, I really want to know, like, what are people most afraid of when they start this practice, or what prevents people from this practice?
Yeah, I mean they're both interrelated, really. But the beauty of anger is that it is just a feeling. It's an energy, and this is not to sound esoteric or poetic in any way, but it essentially is. It's a form of energy. The same way love can be a form of energy. The same way sadness is an energetic feeling in the body. What usually happens with anger is we've been conditioned to believe that it is a bad feeling. There are good feelings, there are bad feelings. And the reality is that it's just a feeling. The good and the bad is the meaning that we actually give to it. If we learn that sometimes anger is a very necessary response to a situation. It's, if someone is being oppressed right in front of you, anger is what motivates you to speak up. It's the
Mm-hmm.
catalyst for justice. If someone is about to attack your family or friends, like anger is what motivates you to stand up. It's what changes worlds. Actually, revolutions have happened because of anger. When enough is enough, like you're motivated to do that. But where anger has become harmful is when people don't know how to harness that anger, the energy of the anger, and they react because of it. And they might react violently, they might react in an abusive way, and then anger just loses its power, right? But if we can be really present with the energy of anger, really genuinely present with it, we can see how it actually sharpens us in that moment, right? It's like the flight or fight response. In a flight or fight response, when we experience it in our body, our blood rushes to the brain, the stomach begins to kind of knot up. All of these are kind of teaching us or telling us that our body is ready for action, for battle.
Mm-hmm.
And anger is the same thing. It can be really harnessed, really powerful, and it motivates us. So the dopamines in our brains, we're really ready to go. We're ready to take action. But to get to that place, we have to be really familiar and be in a good relationship with our bodies. And that is a very, very tough thing for a lot of people to
Yeah.
get to, because our bodies contain so much, so many emotional wounds, trauma and things like that, that anger can feel like a traumatic response to us. And if we don't have a healthy relationship with our body, and if we can't sit in the anger, then we'll want to leave that. And that again is when we, become abusive, when we yell, when we harm people, is that we don't have the ability to really contain the body in that moment.
I think of the differentiation between maybe what you're speaking to of clean anger versus aggression and the things, like clean anger, if I understand you correctly, sort of reclaims or claims or fights, but in a way that is protective of ourself, protective of a group, protective, as where anger that's destructive, it actually doesn't build relationships, it doesn't build intimacy, it doesn't build trust. I think for someone like myself who didn't have really a relationship to anger, I didn't know how to
Mm,
access it. I wouldn't have self-identified, but now I would, in hindsight, identify as being kind of a doormat, a people pleaser,
mm,
a good guy, quote unquote. And I found it really hard to access anger. I was afraid
mm,
of it. As you said, if you don't have a good relationship with it, I didn't have boundaries because I didn't know how to even access the part of me that needed that. I remember when I did this group therapy thing, one of the processes was that I had to rage. And I remember when I accessed this place of exasperation, like where I had never really released like the level of like no. And oh my God, below that was just like first being able to witness myself with that level of power was really
mm.
beautiful. And that I was allowed to only by, being in the presence of other people and I think in experiences. But then also I just wept, which was really interesting. Do you find like grief hides behind that or?
In my experience, you asked me this before, like, why do people really struggle to sit with themselves and what are they afraid of? Often when it comes to anger, what lies beneath the anger is heartbreak.
Hmm,
It's
yeah,
it's
makes
genuine
sense.
heartbreak. And because we don't allow our hearts to break either, because again, that's not allowed, that's not seen as valid. Because for many of us, we don't have that relationship where we can let our hearts genuinely break and allow our world to fall apart, that we build these walls and it becomes hard to keep holding these walls, and we become angry because we have to hold walls, and we
Hmm.
realize we're in a battle with our own feelings and our own emotions and our own mind. And then the anger spreads out, rage comes out, all of these different expressions of resistance kind of come out. But
Hmm.
that's often what lies underneath. And again, that takes a lot of work for anyone that hasn't had emotions and feelings modeled to them in a healthy way from a young age. It becomes something that we are very, very unfamiliar with. And that intimacy as well with ourselves, to let ourselves go there, is something that we work on throughout our lives, with therapy, with all these different practices that we have access to.
That resistance, that's interesting. As you said that, we don't let our hearts break. I think of my resistance to meditation at the beginning of starting to do it. And I would set my timer on my watch and do it for 5 minutes. And I'd be looking for like, oh, fuck, like, are we there yet? Are we there
Mm,
yet? And I think I was really afraid of what I would find. I was afraid of
mm.
unattended to thoughts, unattended to feelings. When you spoke about the anger, accessing anger, and then I think what I experienced was the awareness of all the times I needed what I just accessed, and that caused me to grieve. Does that make sense?
Yeah, regret. That's
Yeah,
grief.
yeah. Like, why didn't, like, I'm sad because now I recognize all the moments I could have used this. If you listen to this podcast, then you know how much I value things like meditation, breathwork, as well as movement practices like yoga. Manoj invited me to try out some classes on the Open app, and I gotta say, I loved it. And not only is the app, from a design perspective, aesthetically gorgeous and beautiful, it was really calming. And my breathwork class actually didn't feel like a digital experience. It felt very much like I was in a mindfulness studio, but on my phone. And the on-demand library had something for every mood, every need, and every energy level. And the teachers are amazing. I personally, right now, my favorites are Manoj and Ali M. If you've never done anything like breathwork before, just to give you some context of how it can help, it really does provide quick relief from things like stress. It helps alleviate anxiety. And for me, it allows a deep presence in my body and an enhanced ability to self-reflect when I'm triggered in those moments of life that, happen in relationship and just in life in general. And meditation has allowed me to witness my mind. It's allowed me to observe my thoughts. And yoga, for me, is like a moving meditation. It's gentler on my body than my HIIT training, and for sure a necessary balance to my kettlebell and weight training. So with all that said, I think you would love it. You should go give it a try. You can invite all your friends to do a class with you. And I've worked with Open to get you 30 days free to try it out and see it if you enjoy it as much as I do. There's a link in the show notes. You can go to withopen.com/createthelove and use the code createthelove for 30 days free. So once again, withopen.com/createthelove. And I'll be sharing this link on socials. As I said, it's in the show notes. Make sure you use the code CreateTheLove at checkout and you get that 30 days free. And you get unlimited live and on-demand breathwork, meditation, yoga, Pilates, and more. And I'm excited to hear how you like it. I'll see you in class. One of the greatest green flags in relationship is if someone has really nice sheets. Right? Like, we all value sleep, of course, and we value feeling comfortable when we're in bed, and that's imperative. And Cozy Earth sheets are my favorite sheets ever. I've loved this product since I discovered them, which is about 5 years ago. They've been on Oprah's favorites list for 4 years in a row. Cozy Earth sheets are softer than cotton. They're incredible. They're temperature regulating, so that means they keep you cool and comfortable all night long. And they believe in their product so much that they have a 10-year warranty on all of them. And they have a 100-night sleep test. So that means that if you're like, I want to try these sheets, I want to see if these sheets really live up to the joy and excitement Mark has for them, they do. You get a 100-night sleep test, so you get to try it for 100 nights. If you don't love them, you can send them back for a full refund. Because Cozy Earth loves that I love these sheets, and they want you to experience them, I've just hooked you up with a 40% off site-wide discount. All you got to use is the code GROVES at checkout. So just my last name at checkout. You get 40% off all their stuff. Go get these sheets. They're incredible. Go to CozyEarth.com and use the code GROVES at checkout for 40% off.
What usually happens when people begin a meditation practice is that perhaps for the first time they've stopped. They've slowed down, and instead of looking outward, they begin to look inward. And as they begin to look inward, everything that they have been running away from, everything that they've been holding up or keeping at bay begins to come. So you'll often hear people saying, I just fall asleep as soon as I start to meditate, or I get sad, or I get agitated, I can't sit still. And these things are present in your everyday life, but all of a sudden you've stopped. There's nothing you have to do, and there they are. They haven't really gone away. And so one of the ways that we can respond to these things so they do go away is to actually look at them, is to actually face them. And one of my favorite teachers, Joseph Goldstein, says, if you want to get to know your mind, sit down and observe it. And as you begin to sit down and observe it, you'll see that. You're like, oh shit, like I wish I had this. And then there is what we call the wanting mind, or it's like, oh, like yesterday's practice was a lot better. And then there's the comparing mind. And then maybe the thought is, I can't meditate. I'm not good at this. I wish I was like this guy that I met one day and he could meditate for 4 hours. And that's the comparison mind or the fixing mind. And you'll begin to see your mind and all the different states that it goes through, all the different ways it just avoids being here with what is. Because often being here with just what is very hard. It's very, very hard when we can't distract ourselves from external stimulation or thinking. We have to just be with ourselves and our body. The grief will arise, the anger will arise, the anxiety will arise, and there's nothing to grasp to, nothing to cling to. And that's a very unfamiliar place for so many of us.
Yeah, I would imagine all of our nudges, our addictions come full swing, which I think maybe now we're starting to see things like our phones as addictions. It occurs to me as you say that it's almost like we're terrified of the totality of the present moment.
We're terrified of the totality of our human experience. That's really what it is.
Yeah, and if we can't sit with it, I guess it's the similar, right? If we can't sit with the realities of whatever is actually going on, because so much of this doing, which I relate to a lot, before I met Kai, I would have identified as very outgoing, extrovert, all these busy, love being out with people. And I started to see that so much of it was an avoidance of just being still.
Yeah, it's also what we've had to potentially do from a young age in order to feel safe.
Yeah.
That's the other thing. For me, I developed very early on the faculties of my mind. I was an incredible storyteller, writer, had a very vivid imagination because, I grew up I was an immigrant when I moved from Sri Lanka to Australia, and I experienced a lot of abuse and a lot of racial abuse in a new country. And in order for me to feel safe and survive in that moment, I had to go off into my mind. And as I got older, my mind just kept on getting stronger, so much so that there was so much knowledge, cognition, like education that I put into it, but I was completely divorced from my body. I was completely divorced from the feeling world. Letting love in was difficult because it just was very unfamiliar. I could understand it conceptually. I could connect to people on a conceptual level. I could look at someone and be like, oh, they fit these boxes. Yes, they're beautiful. Great job. And connect on that level. But on an intimate level, on a more embodied level, it was very difficult and tough for me. And so that's some of the work that, we're able to do with awareness-based practices like yoga and breathwork and meditation, but also therapy and, somatic therapists and embodied therapists. They really help us get back in touch with the feeling world.
I've really started to continue to consider that where the origins of my work too are very cerebral. Like I wanted to do studies. I wanted to understand the science of positive relationships. I wanted to understand the science of relational dysfunction, communication breakdown. What's the impact? All the things that studies could show us, labs could teach us. But it took this awareness that I was, again, as you mentioned, disconnected from the actual somatic experience. And I did, I've done tons of different trainings and done tons of different interventions personally. And I remember when I worked with a somatic therapist, it was like I moved through something that first I never even knew how to identify because it was body related. And a lot of my I was in the neonatal ICU as a baby. I was quite premature, and I was removed from my mom for 10 days and in an incubator thing. And I had this flashback during a shamanic psychotherapy meets shamanic cool workshop that I attended. And I had this vision of my mom being taken from me, but then I couldn't verbalize it. It was this really weird feeling where I had no language. I just cried. And through somatic therapy, I've been able to access that because you don't have words when you're a baby. So it was like this really, can we speak more to the benefits of somatics? And then because what you said about being here and not, that journey to our hearts, I think so many of us struggle with that. So maybe the benefits of somatics and what that means and why it's important, because it feels like it does bypass the intellect. And then if we were to want to take the journey that you took, how would we start and what was your access point?
Yeah, thank you. And I think you actually shared it really beautifully there, where you said, I just cried. I didn't think about it. I just cried. And then that itself is a beautiful expression of being in the body, because what many of us tend to do is, if there are tears, for example, instead of just letting ourselves break down and cry and really release, the cognition will interfere. It's like, why are you crying? Don't cry. Don't be a little baby. Like, he doesn't deserve it, or she doesn't deserve it, or they don't deserve your tears. And then there becomes this battle with the body having a very natural response. And so the work of somatic mindfulness, which is really what I'm involved in, is bringing awareness not just to the body, but actually trying to inhabit the body. And then there's a nuance to that, because we can become aware of the body, but for many of us, we don't exist within the body. And one of my favorite, teachers and brains in this sort of work, her name is Judith Blackstone, and she really talks about how many of us fail to inhabit the body in moments throughout our lives. So, meditation, yoga practice, it crosses over into awareness, which is what we need to begin. Like we are doing yoga, we feel, our palms connected to the mat. We might stick our butt up to the sky. We start to breathe and we're like, oh, okay, like there's all these different things in our body and I'm becoming aware of. And then as we move through the class, we're aware of how our breath is moving. And you'll perhaps get to a point within the end of the class, if you've had a really great class, where you're like, oh, I feel really like grounded. And that's like the first stage of inhabiting the body. The second stage is actually dropping our consciousness within that space. So not just looking at it as an object, like the subject, me, is viewing my foot as an object. It actually merges the two. The subject and the object are one. So I am now the foot. I'm experiencing this moment as the foot. And it sounds very woo even as I say it. But if you just practice it for a moment, like drop your consciousness into your feet, and as you breathe, you feel your feet breathe. And as you feel all the subtle sensations that are happening there, you're not viewing it from a bird's eye view. You're experiencing it. And then you make your way up from your feet to your legs, to your knees, all the way through your body. And there's this remarkable experience that happens throughout the end of it where you realize what I'm experiencing internally and externally, there is a connection with that. Like I can experience you and I can experience me and I can experience myself as a fully inhabited being, I don't have to be in my head trying to work out, oh, what question is Mark about to ask me next? And I hope I answer it correctly. And I hope I sound smart. And I hope I sound this. And already I've left the body at that moment. I'm up here. But to be in here is to have a very intimate moment with whoever you're interacting with. And even if it's nature, like we've all had those moments where we've been in our bodies and we've just felt so connected to everything around us. Those are moments where we're really inhabiting the space underneath the chin. And so somatics is essentially, somatic mindfulness essentially is our ability to constantly be in relationship to our inner world. And there are, the conceptual body, we talk about it in mindfulness a lot. The conceptual body is our ideas about the body. I'm good looking, I'm thin, I'm this, I'm that. Then there is the subtle body we speak to a lot, which is really the feelings and the emotions. And then there's like the inner body, which is, the deepest part of ourselves, which is the space that you can't really explain. The space where you just feel intrinsically connected. Flow happens from that space. There is no anticipation. There is no rumination. There is just this expression of the present moment. And it takes work for a lot of us to arrive in that space. It takes work because we haven't had that modeled. And our society doesn't live in an embodied way. It lives
Right.
very much in a disembodied way, where from the moment we wake up in the morning, we grab our phones, we check our schedules, we look on social media, and already we've left our inner world. We haven't woken up and been like, how am I feeling today? Yeah, this feels good. Like what's going on internally? It's like, no, as soon as we wake up, it's outside. And for the next 16 hours that we're awake, we're outside.
So true.
And so the invitation through some of these practices is to come back a little bit, because we can't exist solely on the inside. We have to be in relationship with the external world, but we can inhabit ourselves a lot more. So as we move through our day, there's more of a synergy between the mind and the body. And that synergy is super powerful. When we match our cognition, which is already so powerful, which this sense of embodiment, it's a very different experience to life when we're moving like that.
Yeah, because we, as you said, we tend to live solely outside, which is so survival based. You think about it, like if you're in hustle culture, you're trying to survive, you're trying to pay rent, you're trying, not to mention that our phones are designed to have us live in them. Like they're perfectly designed. I think about this a lot, that unless we develop a mindfulness practice, we don't really stand a chance against phones. We don't stand, because they have hundreds of behavioral scientists figuring out how to make it so you don't stand a chance, which is really exploitive, but true.
Absolutely. And again, I notice my body when I go a week or 2 weeks spending too much time on my phone, I start to feel just icky. Like I start to feel tight and constricted. And that's when I know, ooh, I shouldn't be using my phone right before I go to bed. I've done this new trick recently where I've deleted Instagram and Facebook and Twitter and from my home screen. So if I have to use those apps, I have to go and type it in and then use it, or I use it on my desktop, which should just cut out the habituated response that I might have had previously when I'm waiting at the coffee shop to just reach and grab my phone.
Yeah.
Or whenever I'm feeling an emotion I don't like, to distract myself by going into those things. So I don't know how else to move through this world without a mindfulness practice. It's just almost a biological imperative at this point for our own well-being. And I don't say that because it's my industry or my work, but I struggle with it too. And, it's just something that for people that don't have a mindfulness practice, I don't know how they can work with that. It's just so much tougher.
I don't know how you can operate in successful relationships without a mindfulness practice.
Yeah.
I have no idea. Like, if we're trying to be better communicators, better partners, better family members, better parents, we have to cultivate that space you're talking about, that space that lives between, the stimulus and the choice to do something more wise, to be something different. And I do think about how powerful that change is of, like, if you look at behavioral patterns and you look up your family tree, you can see the reactivity, you can see the defensiveness. And that's why that act of creating mindfulness, to think about, where does this behavior come from, and is it constructive to the life and relationships I want to create? And what is, it seems like a kind of a non-negotiable, not even kind of, it seems like a non-negotiable, because without self-awareness, you can't change your life. Like, you can't.
You really can't. You really can't. And it's not even about changing your life. You can't have the quality of life that is your birthright. It
Right.
really is. It's like our natural state is a state of joy. It is a state of inner peace, and it's a state of clarity. But so much of that has been clouded by the external world and external stimulus. So if we want to enhance our relationships, if we want to enhance our solo time, this understanding of ourselves is pivotal. And truthfully, it doesn't take that long. It doesn't take that long to develop that. It just takes a commitment to realize that no more will I just let my days go by without awareness. Like, I'm sick of having this kind of experience with the world. I want to feel free. I
Right.
want to feel in love. I want to access these states that are within me. And the only reason you're able to access them in the first place is because it's within you. It's not that someone else is going to come along and place them inside of you. It's there, and someone becomes a reflection of that. So, developing a practice can be as simple as, I'm not going to turn my phone on for the first 2 hours of the day, and I'm just going to be really present. Another thing I always tell my students is, the moment you realize you are no longer present is the moment you become present. So every time you realize that, it's like, oh, cool, I'm present again. And you're having a conversation with your partner and you're thinking about food and you catch yourself, it's like, oh, I'm present, come back. And, from a neuroscientific perspective, every time you do that, you're essentially creating new neural pathways, in the regions of the brain associated with emotion regulation, short-term memory, and decision-making. So it has a health benefit as well. But above that, a very practical benefit is that your partner realizes you're really present with them. And that's just beautiful in and of itself.
Yeah, it is. Especially, I know if I have my phone and I'm talking to my partner, it's a quick way to for her to be like, deal breaker, put your phone down, or this conversation is over. I'm like, great,
Yeah.
okay, I'm not present. The other night I did breath work, like it was like a 6-minute breath work class of yours. And it was kind of like a closing of the day kind of thing. It was really nice. And
Yeah.
I was really struck by how even that short of a practice had me present in my body, counting the breaths, holding the breaths. One thing about breath work that I was afraid of, in hindsight now it's one of my favorite practices. But in hindsight, I was actually really afraid of how it made me feel. Like, it was almost like I was so in my body. I was so alive. I didn't know breath could do that to me. Like, I felt like I just crushed a couple grams of psilocybin. Can you talk a little bit about the physiological process, and maybe, again, I'm guessing it's similar fears to mindfulness?
Yeah, I mean, it is and it isn't. I think the ultimate destination can be a similar place. You're present and connected to yourself and the world around you, but the avenues there can be different. With mindfulness or meditation, it's more of a development of awareness. So you train in becoming more aware of your cognitive experience, your embodied experience, feelings, emotions, and you tend to access it through placing awareness on an object. It could be your breath. It could be sounds, it could be sensations, it could just be being like really present to this moment without any sort of anchor.
Mm-hmm.
With breathwork, we're taking more of an active approach. We're more engaged, so we're actively using our breath in a way to transform our physiological experience. Now, there are many types of breath work. It's important to also realize, like, a lot of these practices are indigenous practices. They're not practices that have been developed out of the blue. Some are, for sure. There are practices that have been developed by the Navy SEALs and the Army and science and things like that. But a lot of these practices have been around in indigenous cultures for centuries. And it's simple because it's accessible at almost every point, because it sits literally underneath your nose. And so there are usually a few categories of breath work. There's up regulatory practices that give you energy and that stimulate your nervous system. And there are down regulatory practices which, calm you down, really ground you. And there are, this category we call like transformational practices, where Stanislav Grof was really instrumental. Stanislav Grof was a professor, I think it was at Harvard, and he was working with Timothy Leary on psychedelic research for a period of time. And then when Harvard banned Timothy Leary, I think, Stanislav Grof was also kind of involved in that whole process. And he really tried to explore ways of accessing transcendental states in a natural, safe, and legal way, and was the founder of holotropic breathwork. Interestingly, holotropic takes its Latin name. I think it's holos. I could be wrong there, but it essentially means for wholeness. It's cultivating wholeness, and I love that definition of
me too.
how the breath can help us really cultivate this sense of wholeness within us, because it's already something that we possess, the breath. And so the transformational practices can range from 35 minutes to 3 hours, in which we are, hyperventilating, essentially using a hyperventilated breathing practice that begins to not only affect our physiology, but also begins to transcend that and move into the mind. And we have, states of euphoria. We might have states, our classes have people crying uncontrollably or laughing uncontrollably. And again, we're moving beyond the mind, which is the really exciting part, where we're cutting below the conceptual mind, where the mind is saying to us, "Ooh, don't cry in a room full of people. This is really weird." And the body is just experiencing itself at that moment.
Body's like, sorry, you don't have choice right now.
Yeah, it's too late. And it becomes a really profound experience. But then there are these shorter practices, like you spoke about, which really prepare us for meditation or for the day. I use my favorite breathing practice is one that was taught by a neuroscientist called Andrew Huberman. It's called the physiological sigh. Essentially, it's one deep breath in, and then followed by a quick, sharp breath. So I'll demonstrate it. Maybe we can do one together.
Yeah.
And then the exhale is a long, drawn-out breath out through the mouth. So we tend to do 3 of these, but we'll just do one. Take a big breath in, and another quick breath up, and then exhale slowly out the mouth.
I mean, I already feel like lighter just from one.
Right. And Huberman explains the neuroscientific benefits of doing 3 of those. But it's apparently the quickest way to reduce stress that we have access to. So it's something that I use throughout my day, in between meetings, in LA traffic. The breath can be so powerful, and I think we're just starting to realize the power that it really contains and how instantaneous it is to be able to shift our state. Whereas a yoga class or a meditation class takes some cultivation, takes some training, takes some time where people are like, am I doing it right? I don't know if I'm doing it right. Is it working? Whereas the breath gives you immediate feedback.
Mm-hmm.
So it becomes a really powerful tool that's there with us all the time.
So if we're entering this journey, like for the person listening, we talked about being able to access your somatic experience, being able to create more space between who you have been and what you want to create, accessing wisdom. How might we start this practice or deepen it? And maybe you could share just some of the opportunities that people have on your app. Like, as I said at the beginning, the design is insane. I've done a few of the classes. I've done some of the yoga classes with Kai. And yeah, I'm curious if you could just maybe walk people through how to begin or continue that.
Yeah, I think the one caveat I'll say is that accessing the body is different for everyone. For those of us that have had, complex trauma or emotional wounding, it can feel like a very foreign and unsafe place. In which cases, I would always recommend working with a therapist to get to that place. But there are places that you can begin. And, in trauma-informed mindfulness training, we learn a lot about titration. Titration is this ability where you can very gently tap in and then tap out. It's like, when you are about to go into the ocean and you're like, oh, it's a bit cold. You put your toe in there. It's like, oh, no, too cold. And then you maybe put a toe in again, and maybe 3 toes. Maybe you submerge your foot. And then when you feel comfortable, maybe you'll dive in. And so exploring the body when there's trauma and emotional wounding is a little bit like that. And also working with, someone that's qualified. But there are places we can begin to build this relationship with our bodies. Yoga is a really great way to do it. Breathwork is another great way to do it. And of course, meditation and mindfulness. From there, it's a matter of what resonates with you, because, different voices resonate with different people. Different people, like different teachers, you'll connect with. But a good place to really begin is a practice called body scan, which is a simple mindfulness practice where you just place your attention on the body, starting with your feet all the way up to the head and then maybe back down. Yeah, I would say that's the place that we really begin. But my real advice when it comes to exploring the body and somatics is to be very gentle with ourselves. We can bring this attitude of competition and achievement, which is again a disembodied state that we tend to go to, where we feel like we have to constantly be 10 steps ahead of other people, and we have to constantly be achieving, and it's all about growth, nonstop growth. And just to be like, oh, this is a lifelong journey and a lifelong relationship I'm about to begin with my body. And you start very compassionately from that place, because you'll slip up and you just keep coming back, and you realize this relationship with my body is something that we're going to have to unravel over time. And there'll be childhood stuff that'll come. There'll be traumatic stuff that'll come. There'll be joy. There'll be screams, laughter. All of those things will happen. But if you're in true relationship, and you speak about this a lot, if you're in true relationship, it's a commitment to just show up for that person. And in this case, you're showing up day after day for your body. And that takes lots of patience.
That gentle process. I like that. The analogy of putting your toe in, at this point, I'm doing cold plunging. So I do relate. I'm like, let's go all in. And with breath work, I definitely had to start with smaller. With meditation, I had to start, I couldn't even do 5 minutes, and now I can sit for an hour. And it's incredible the benefits that it does for our life, our relationships. Manoj, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your thoughts and your direction and your wisdom, and giving us some tools to be able to dive deeper into ourselves, live the richness of life that we, as you said, is our birthright. Manoj, thanks so much for being here. I really appreciate you, your time, for sharing your wisdom and giving us the access, this invitation to access this presence to a life that, as you said, is our birthright, to be present to the joy, to the possibility, to the totality of the moment, and really cultivate that space between stimulus and response and access wisdom. I'm curious, for the people listening, where can they find more of you? And I know that we have a special opportunity with Open for you, the listeners.
Of course, yeah. I mean, firstly, thank you so much for your time. You're such a wonderful host. You ask such great questions, and I'm always struck by how present you are whenever I've met you and spoken with you. So thank you for that. For me personally, you can get my book. It's available on Amazon. It's called Still Together. You can find me on Instagram or my website, which I rarely use these days. I don't know who uses websites anymore. But for all the guests, or anyone listening that wants to really, explore these practices and start to build a relationship with your body, it's open.com on the App Store. There's also a polyamory app called Open, so it's not that one. It's Open Mindfulness, and there is a special code called Create the Love that you can access for 30 days for free.
Perfect. Well, for all of you listening, you get 30 days to check it out, try it out, and begin those practices or continue and deepen them. Thank you so much for being here, my friend. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, same.
Thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode. If this episode resonated with you, one of the best ways to support the show is to go subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss any more. leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to it, or share the episode with your community on Instagram or whatever social place you like to hang out. This helps get it into more people's ears, and I'm so grateful for your support, always. Thanks again for tuning in. Much love.